The gavel didn't sound like justice. It sounded like a demolition ball smashing through the only life I had left. Custody awarded to the father, the judge said, his eyes scanning a file that Jared's lawyers had filled with lies. Due to the mother's financial instability and lack of a permanent residence, it is in the best interest of the children. Just like that, Molly and Bryce were gone. Jared smoothed the lapel of his $3,000 suit and leaned toward me, his voice a low toxic purr that only I could hear. You were nothing without me. He expected me to scream. He expected me to fall to my knees and beg. But I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. I just turned my back on the man who stole my life, walked out the heavy oak doors and didn't look back. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. And hit subscribe if you've ever been underestimated. I drove 2 hours north, watching the pristine suburbs of my former life dissolve into dense, unkempt pine forest. My phone sat on the passenger seat silent. I had turned it off the moment I left the courthouse. Jared would be expecting the call, the pleading voicemail, the negotiation for visitation, the sound of my breaking point. He wouldn't get it. Silence was the only currency I had left, and I wasn't going to spend it cheap. The GPS led me down a gravel track that hadn't seen fresh stone in a decade, and then there it was, the asset. My mother Susan had left me this A-frame cabin 3 years ago. Jared had called it a teardown, a liability on our tax return that he tried to force me to sell 6 times. I had refused not out of sentiment but out of instinct. Now looking at the moss-covered roof and the sagging deck, I realized that instinct had been survival. I stepped out of the car. The air here was different, sharp, cold, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. I walked the perimeter of the structure. My eyes didn't see a home. They saw a project site. The fascia boards were rotting. The gutter system had failed years ago, directing water straight into the foundation. To anyone else, this was a ruin. To a former architect, it was a structural challenge. It was standing. That was enough. The key turned in the lock with a grinding protest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and abandonment. White dust sheets covered the furniture like shrouds. I pulled one off the sofa, sending a cloud of dust into the twilight, filtering through the dirty floor to ceiling windows. No electricity. I tried the tap. The pipes groaned, spat a stream of brown water, and then died. I sat on the edge of the sofa, the temperature inside dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the tree line. My breath began to fog in the air. This was my reality. No radiant floor heating, no smart home climate control, just 4 walls that were barely holding back the elements. My hand hovered over my phone again. It would be so easy. 1 call, 1 admission of defeat. Jared would let me see Molly and Bryce if I crawled. He would set me up in a cheap apartment if I signed away my dignity. But that wasn't a lifeline. It was a noose. I pulled the heavy, dust-smelling sheet around my shoulders and lay down on the couch. The cold seeped through my thin coat, settling into my bones. I didn't close my eyes immediately. I stared up at the dark, vaulted ceiling, tracing the lines of the rafters in the gloom. The roof was leaking in the corner. I could hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip on the floorboards. Let it leak. Let it rot. I wasn't afraid of the decay. I had spent 10 years maintaining the pristine hollow facade of Jared's empire. I knew how to build things that looked perfect and stood for nothing. This cabin was different. It was broken, ugly, and failing. But it was mine. And unlike my marriage, the foundation here was real. I closed my eyes, shivering under the sheet, and for the first time in a decade, I slept without a sedative. The cold was just a fact. And facts I could manage. Daylight didn't make the cabin look better. It just exposed the cracks I hadn't seen in the dark. I stood in the center of the living room, exhaling a plume of white vapor, and did exactly what Jared said I couldn't do. I assessed the structural integrity of my life. I didn't have tools, so I improvised. I used a rusted tire iron from the trunk of my car to pry up the water-damaged floorboards in the kitchen. The wood screamed as it gave way, revealing the crawl space below. Dry rot. It had eaten into the subfloor, turning solid oak into black sponge. Most people would have looked at that rot and seen a money pit. They would have seen a disaster. I saw a punch list. Jared used to tell his friends at dinner parties that I didn't have a head for business. He'd laugh, swirling his $50 scotch, and say Savannah keeps the home fires burning but leave the heavy lifting to the big boys. I ripped up another plank, the physical exertion, sending a jolt of heat through my freezing arms. He was wrong. I hadn't just kept the fires burning. I was the one who designed the fireplace, sourced the fuel, and ensured the chimney didn't collapse on our heads while he slept. Society likes to call it being a housewife. They package it in soft words like nurturing and domestic. But as I stared at the exposed joists of my mother's cabin, I realized the truth. I hadn't been a wife. I had been a project manager for a high-risk, volatile asset named Jared. When he forgot to file the permits for his downtown high-rise, I was the one who spent 3 days at the city clerk's office charming the administrators until they rushed the paperwork. When his contractors threatened to walk off the job because he screamed at the foreman, I was the one who showed up with coffee apologies and a renegotiated timeline that saved the project. He called it nagging. I called it crisis aversion. He called it shopping. I called it procurement and inventory management. For 10 years, I had been running a boutique logistics firm with one ungrateful client. I had managed schedules, balanced 7-figure budgets, and mitigated risk every single day. I didn't have a gap in my resume. I had a decade of undocumented executive experience. I tossed the rotted wood into a pile by the back door. The dust coated my throat, but I didn't cough. I felt a strange, cold clarity settling in. Jared thought he had stripped me of my career. He thought that by taking my license and my title, he had taken my ability. He was an idiot. I wasn't starting from scratch. I was just switching job sites. This cabin was a mess, yes. The plumbing was shot, the roof was compromised, and the electrical wiring was probably a fire hazard. But unlike Jared, this house had good bones. The main beams were solid. The foundation, though buried under years of neglect, was stone. I grabbed a notebook from my purse and a pen. I didn't write about my feelings. I didn't journal about my heartbreak. I wrote Phase 1, stabilization. I listed the materials I needed. I calculated the load-bearing capacity of the new joists. I sketched a quick schematic of the water diversion system I needed to dig outside to save the foundation. My hand moved across the paper with a speed I hadn't felt since architecture school. The lines were straight. The math was perfect. I wasn't a discarded woman shivering in the woods. I was an architect reclaiming her site. And for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't building a monument to a man's ego. I was building a fortress for myself. By the 3rd day, the cabin wasn't livable, but it was survivable. I had jury-rigged a water collection system using tarps and buckets, and I'd cleared enough debris from the fireplace to risk a small fire. But the real problem was the north wall of what used to be my mother's studio. The drywall was swollen with water damage, bowing out like a bruised lung. It had to come down before the black mold spread to the rest of the structure. I didn't have a sledgehammer, so I used the back of a heavy cast-iron skillet I found in the kitchen. Thud. Plaster dust rained down. Thud. A chunk of drywall broke free, revealing the damp insulation behind it. I swung again harder, channeling every ounce of frustration into the impact. The wall crumbled. I pulled away the soggy insulation, wearing a bandana over my face to filter the mold spores. And then I saw it. It wasn't a stud. It was steel. Embedded between the framing, perfectly flush with the studs so it wouldn't be noticeable unless you stripped the wall down to the bones, was a safe. It wasn't a cheap home office lockbox. It was an industrial-grade, fireproof wall safe, the kind you see in bank vaults or jewelry stores. I stared at it, the iron skillet heavy in my hand. My mother, Susan, was an art teacher. She painted watercolors of lakes and taught 3rd graders how to mix primary colors. Why did she have a safe that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast? I wiped the dust from the digital keypad. The battery light wasn't blinking. It was dead. Of course. It had probably been sitting here since before she died 3 years ago. I found a 9-volt battery in a smoke detector in the hallway, ironic, and swapped it out. The keypad beeped to life, the red light glowing menacingly in the dim room. Combination. I tried the obvious ones first. Her birthday, my birthday, the day she bought the cabin. Error, error, error. The safe locked me out for 5 minutes. I sat on the floor surrounded by debris and closed my eyes. Think. Mom wasn't sentimental about dates. She was sentimental about us. About moments. I remembered a day when I was 10. We were sitting on this very floor before the rot, before the neglect. She was teaching me how to draw perspective. Lines don't lie, Savannah, she'd said. People lie. Structures don't. Structures. I looked at the safe again. It wasn't just installed, it was integrated into the load-bearing wall. She had put it here when she reinforced the cabin years ago. I remembered the date because it was the only time she'd ever missed a parent-teacher conference. August 8, 2023. 80823. My fingers hovered over the keys. Beep, 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 beep. Click. The sound was louder than the wind outside. The heavy steel door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. I expected cash. Maybe some old jewelry. What I found was tubes. Dozens of black architectural storage tubes stacked like honeycomb. I pulled one out. It was heavy. I unscrewed the cap and slid out a roll of large blue-tinted paper. I unrolled it on the dusty floor, smoothing the corners. The breath left my lungs. It was a schematic, a complex, brilliant structural design for a 60-story high-rise. The lines were sharp, confident, hand-drawn with an artisan's precision. In the bottom right corner in the title block was the date May 1998, and the signature Susan V. Moore. I knew this building. Everyone knew this building. It was the Helix Tower in downtown Chicago. The building that launched Jared's career. The building he claimed he designed on a napkin in a coffee shop. The building that won him the Pritzker Prize consideration. He hadn't designed it. I grabbed another tube. The Apex Center. Signed Susan V. Moore 2001. Another tube. The Vanguard Spire. Signed Susan V. Moore 2005. My mother hadn't been an art teacher. She had been the ghost. The silent engine. The genius behind the man who called me useless. Jared hadn't just stolen my life. He had stolen hers. He had built an entire empire on the back of a woman he dismissed as eccentric, stealing her intellectual property and passing it off as his own genius. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, cold, lethal. I wasn't looking at paper. I was looking at a nuclear weapon, and for the first time in my life, my finger was on the button. At the bottom of the safe beneath the tubes was a manila envelope. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, angular, architectural. "My dearest Savannah," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the dam finally broke. I always knew it would. Jared is a man who consumes, and eventually he runs out of fuel." I sat back against the cold wall, the letter trembling in my hand. "You grew up thinking I was just a teacher who liked to paint on weekends," she wrote. "But in the 80s, no firm would hire a woman without putting her in the back room to draft stairwells. So I made a deal. I sold my designs to men who needed the credit. It paid for this cabin. It paid for your education. It was a compromise I made to survive." I traced the ink with my thumb. Compromise. That word had been the soundtrack of my life. But Jared, he was different. He didn't just buy my work, he stole it. He found my sketchbook when you were dating. He borrowed the concept for the Helix. When I confronted him, he laughed. He said no one would believe a school teacher over a rising star. He threatened to ruin your reputation if I spoke up. He used my love for you as a leash. Rage, hot and blinding, flared in my chest. He hadn't just silenced me. He had silenced us both. He had built a glass ceiling over our entire lineage and called it a penthouse. "I stayed small, so you could grow tall," the letter continued. "But I kept the proofs. Every sketch, every dated schematic, every original copyright filing I made under my maiden name before he ever saw them. They are all here. They are your inheritance. Do not make my mistake, Savannah. Do not compromise. Burn his empire down." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The grief I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, fierce pride. My mother wasn't a victim. She was a sleeper agent. She had played the long game, enduring decades of silence just to arm me for this exact moment. My phone buzzed on the floor, vibrating against the hardwood. I picked it up. A notification from my bank app, access denied. Account frozen. Then, a text from Jared. "I've filed an emergency motion. The court agrees that a rotting shack with no utilities isn't a suitable environment for children. Supervised visitation only starting next month. Unless..." 3 dots danced on the screen. "Unless you sell me the land. My developers need that parcel for the new resort. Sign the deed over for $50,000 and I'll let you see them on Christmas." He didn't know. He thought I was desperate. He thought I was broke, freezing and broken. He thought he was negotiating with a mother who would trade her last asset for a glimpse of her children. He didn't know he was negotiating with the owner of his entire career. I typed a reply, my fingers steady. "Send the contract. I'm ready to talk." I wasn't surrendering. I was opening the gate. He wanted the land. I'd give him the land. But he had no idea what was buried underneath it. I didn't meet Jared immediately. Strategy requires verification. The blueprints looked real, the paper was yellowed, the ink faded in the right places, but Jared had a team of lawyers who could argue forgery. I needed an expert. I drove into town, the tubes rattling in the passenger seat. Heather ran the county archives, a dusty basement office filled with property records and local history. She was meticulous, cynical, and hated Jared ever since he bulldozed a historic post office to build a parking garage. "Heather," I said, placing a tube on her desk. "I need you to date this." She adjusted her glasses, pulling out the schematic. She ran her fingers over the paper, texture smelled the ink, and checked the watermark. Then she went to her computer. "This paper stock was discontinued in 2006, she said, her voice flat. "The stamp here, that's a notary seal from a firm that went bankrupt in 1999. And this signature," she pulled up a digital file, "matches the deed transfer on your cabin. It's Susan's. Can you certify that?" "I can do better. I can notarize an affidavit stating these documents predate the filing of the Helix Tower patents by 3 years. Why? Because Jared claims he designed the Helix." Heather looked at me, then back at the drawing. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. She stamped the document with a heavy thud. "I'll testify. Just tell me when." Armed with the affidavit, I went to the second part of the plan. The land. Why did Jared want this specific parcel? The cabin was worthless to him. It had to be the location. I pulled the deed from the safe. My mother had added a codicil, an addendum to the property rights 10 years ago. It was buried in legal jargon, but my time managing Jared's contracts helped me decode it. Conservation Covenant Class B. It restricted commercial development that exceeded 2 stories, but there was a clause. Restriction may be lifted by the current owner provided a full audit of all architectural intellectual property intended for the site is submitted to the original grantor's estate for review. My mother had booby-trapped the land. If Jared wanted to build his resort here, he needed the restriction lifted. To lift it, he needed my signature. And the moment he started building, the clause would trigger an audit that would compare his new designs against the estate's records. The estate records I now held in my hands. He needed the land. I needed him to take it. I texted him. "I'll sign. Meet me at the lawyer's office in an hour. Bring the check." I wasn't just giving him a golden bridge to retreat across. I was building him a bridge made of dynamite, handing him the match and waiting for him to light it. Jared's office was exactly as I remembered it, chrome, glass, and intimidation. He sat behind his desk, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked bored. He didn't stand when I entered. He just slid a contract across the polished mahogany. "You look tired, Savannah," he said, fake concern dripping from his voice. "This is for the best." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I looked at the contract. It was standard, a quitclaim deed transferring the cabin land to his development firm for $50,000, but attached to the back was the custody agreement. Full reinstatement of joint custody, unsupervised. He wanted the land so badly he was trading our children for it. "There's one condition," I said, my voice quiet. "I want the settlement increased. To cover the inconvenience of moving." Jared laughed. It was a sharp barking sound. Greedy to the end. "And I want a clause added." I continued, sliding my own piece of paper across the desk. "Standard release of liability. I don't want to be sued if the land turns out to be difficult." Jared barely glanced at it. He was so focused on victory, so focused on the fact that he was stripping me of my last asset, that he didn't see the trap. He saw a bridge. A golden bridge. In strategy, you never corner an enemy completely. You leave them a path to escape. A path that looks safe. A path that leads them right where you want them. By giving him the land, I wasn't surrendering. I was handing him the detonator. He signed my addendum. I signed his deed. "Done," he said, snatching the papers. "You have 48 hours to vacate. My crews break ground on Monday." "Monday," I repeated. "Good luck with the project, Jared. I hear the foundation is everything." I walked out of the office. I didn't feel relief. I felt the cold, heavy weight of finality. He had the land. He had the bridge. Now all I had to do was wait for him to take the first step. On Monday morning, the excavators arrived at the cabin. Jared was there, wearing a hard hat for the photo op, smiling for the local press. A new era for luxury, he told the reporters. At 9:05 a.m., my lawyer, hired with the last of my savings, filed the motion. Notice of covenant violation and intellectual property audit. The moment the first shovel hit the dirt, the clause in my mother's deed activated. It was automatic. It froze the title. It triggered a mandatory third-party audit of all architectural plans associated with the development to ensure compliance with the conservation restriction. And who was the auditor named in the covenant? The estate of Susan V. Moore. I walked onto the site at 9:30 a.m. Jared saw me and stormed over. "What the hell is this? I have a court order." "You have a deed," I said, my voice carrying over the idling engines. "But you didn't read the fine print. The land comes with conditions. You can't build here without an IP audit." "I designed this building," he shouted, pointing to the rendering on the sign. "It's my intellectual property." "Is it?" I pulled the black tube from my bag. I unscrewed the cap. I pulled out the blueprint, the one dated 1998, signed by my mother. I held it up next to his rendering. The silence on the construction site was absolute. The lines were identical. The structure was identical. The only difference was the signature. "You didn't design anything, Jared. You stole it. You stole from a woman you called eccentric. You stole from my mother, and now the entire world is going to know." I dropped the blueprints at his feet. "Get off my land." The fallout wasn't just a scandal. It was a demolition. When Heather, the county archivist, released her affidavit confirming the dates on my mother's blueprints, Jared's investors didn't just pull out, they sued. The Helix Tower, the crown jewel of his portfolio, became the center of a massive intellectual property lawsuit. Jared tried to fight it. He went on TV claiming I was a bitter ex-wife trying to frame him. But facts are stubborn things. Lines don't lie. When independent auditors compared my mother's hand-drawn schematics to his digital files, the match was perfect. He hadn't just copied them. He had traced them. His reputation collapsed overnight. He was stripped of his architectural awards. His firm dissolved under the weight of legal fees and fraud investigations. He lost the penthouse, the cars, the status, everything he had built on stolen ground. And me, I got my children back. Full custody awarded by a judge who finally saw that stability isn't about bank accounts, it's about integrity. We didn't move back to the suburbs. I kept the cabin. I finished the renovations, but I didn't turn it into a resort. I turned it into the Susan V. Moore Studio, a design collective for female architects who have been pushed to the margins. We work here surrounded by the forest. My mother loved building structures that honor the people who live in them, not the egos of the men who pay for them. Sometimes late at night, I sit on the new deck and look at the stars. I think about my mother drafting skyscrapers at her kitchen table while the world ignored her. She didn't get to see her name on a building in her lifetime. But now, every time I sign a blueprint, I sign it for both of us. Jared built a glass castle on a foundation of lies. I built a fortress on a foundation of truth. And my foundation held. If this story reminded you of your own strength, please share it. You never know who needs to hear that they are more than what someone else says they are.